Hello and welcome to the Business Post podcast with me, Danny McConnell.
And me, Peter O'Dwyer.
Now, we're a week on or so from the Taoiseach's, I suppose, much anticipated brawling or mauling in the White House. Now, he's survived that, Peter. But I suppose it's not just Micheál Martin's trip to the White House that has now become involved in this kind of St. Patrick's Day, I won't say extravaganza, but it's not a circus either. But I mean, it is a pretty extensive operation, not just from the state, but from agencies like Ibec. And our guest this week is Danny McCoy, the chief executive of Ibec, who kind of, is just freshly back from not only Washington, but also Brussels as well. So a very front-facing kind of week for him and his organisation. You did the interview with him. What was your overall impression of, I suppose, the week that he had and kind of the context that he set on it?
Yeah, it's like what we were really trying to get to the bottom of in the podcast was, how does he measure the success of these sorts of trips? Because they've kind of become, as you say, par for the course with representative organisations, with private business, and of course with the government themselves. And as I say, when I'm chatting to him, it's always good to listen. It's always good to be meeting different people. But how do you actually measure? Is this of real value to Ibec, and most importantly, of real value to their clients?
Is it a jolly?
And he does say, if we don't do X, Y, and Z, it is just tourism. So trying to find, what are the key meetings you have over there? What relationships have been built? What are the tangible benefits that you bring back to your members? And do they ask you? Do they hold you to account about what were you doing over there for me? So that's what we were trying to get to the bottom of in the podcast.
And it's interesting that Ibec itself, we kind of refer to as Ibec as one single entity, but actually, as he made the point, it has 39 subsidiary organisations and trade organisations, often with differing kind of agendas and differing sort of motivations. And I suppose the extent of its reach, the extent of its, I suppose, its membership, I thought came through in the podcast as well. But I thought it was interesting that the shift in tone toward Ireland in America, he gives voice to that in the podcast, and I thought that was certainly something, or the strength of what he said was, I hadn't heard that certainly in recent weeks.
And he drew the important distinction, I think, between how Ireland is viewed and how the EU is viewed.
Yes, and
they're a bit different. We're coming off slightly better, at least for now, in that reckoning, but Ireland as part of the EU is not in a particularly good place in US eyes.
You're a long-term watcher of business in Ireland, and what's your overall assessment going into the interview with Danny McCoy? What was your overall assessment of Ibec, its effectiveness, its power, its reach, etc.?
I mean, it is the preeminent, the biggest business lobby group in the country. I think in the round they do a good job, like just looking through a journalistic lens when a topic crops up. Do they usually have something to say about it? Yes, they do. And they usually have a position. It's not just top of the head, the Business Post is wrong, we better say something to them. They have a position. But as we get into in the interview, there's a couple of issues of late.
Mercosur being one. Yeah.
Where, again, in the newsroom, when we were saying, get onto Ibec and see what they have to say about that, and we were getting radio silence back. So I wanted to kind of delve into that with Danny to understand, well, should you not have been doing more? Where was Ibec? And he has an explanation for that. And there's a few other domestic topics as well. So of late, I've just found it interesting that, there are some topics I would have expected them to say more on that they didn't. And we get into as well, we had the Taoiseach on the show a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking to Daniel Murray about the evolving nature of the Taoiseach's office.
Sort of the international kind of aspect.
More outward looking. Yeah. And it kind of struck me from speaking to Danny that maybe his role has become more outward looking and more international. Now, as you'll hear in the podcast, he says that's not quite the case. He always feels like head of Ibec has been an international kind of role. But I suppose it's the world, the geopolitical chaos of the last couple of years maybe has made every sort of role at that level a little bit more globally focused, because when the whole world order is up for grabs, maybe you have to do a bit more global outreach. And
what was your impression heading into it of Danny McCoy himself? Because he's there a long time. He's 17 years as chief executive of Ibec.
Yeah, I say this against myself. I realised halfway through it, he has been the head of Ibec for the entirety of my journalism career, but I don't know how many years he's been head of Ibec. It was interesting to hear 17 years. I won't pretend to have, despite the fact that Danny McCoy has always been there and has been accessible to the media, and as we touch upon, I've been at events with him and I've interviewed him or done doorsteps. I've never really got a proper sense of Danny as a person, I suppose. And I wouldn't like to try and portray that I have a deeper understanding of him than I do. He certainly seems to be effective. If you're 17 years in a role like that, you're going to have to be.
I'm sure targets and kind of managing it.
Well,
it's a business, as he says himself. It's not just a lobby group, it's a business.
Exactly, and I won't pretend to know the fine details of the politics of Ibec, but when you have 39 trade associations sitting under you, some could view that as 39 potential replacements at any given time.
Absolutely.
When you leave aside even the external people. So, listen, he has to be a good operator if he's kept 17 years at the helm of Ibec. But I don't know him on a kind of personal level or in any sort of deep level, despite all that time that he's been there.
And how would you assess their relationship with the state? Because again, it might be, I won't say easy, but do they sometimes fall in, yes, they're a lobby group, but given that they're a business lobby group and they're an employers lobby group, do they fall into the kind of space that, Enterprise Ireland and IDA, they're almost seen as the third agency of that. But how would you assess their relationship with the state? I mean, are they known for sort of lashing the state or bashing the state?
I don't think so. Now, maybe some of that goes on behind the scenes that we don't know. But they don't seem to have a particularly adversarial relationship with the government, with the state writ large. Some of the other smaller, or some not so small lobby groups do seem to be more of a thorn in the side. They're more vocal. They do give the government a kicking when they don't like whatever policy comes their way. Yeah. That's not Ibec's way, or at least never the Ibec that I've known. Maybe it was previously. They presumably feel like they get more done with just trying to work constructively. But I don't remember any huge blow up between Ibec and the government ever, really.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think as listeners will hear in the podcast, Danny refers to the long game, essentially. Like you might win today, but you lose tomorrow type thing. But anyway, that's enough talking for us, I think, for now.
Absolutely.
Here now is our interview, or Peter's interview, I should say, with Danny McCoy of Ibec.
Danny McCoy, you're very welcome to Business Pulse podcast.
Thank you very much, Peter.
You are just back from a series of travels. So you were in New York, Ottawa and DC, is that right?
Yeah, I wasn't in all of them now. I was in the States, all right. A colleague was in Ottawa to meet with Prime Minister Carney. Ibec, probably for about 12 years now, I've been in a kind of a steady rhythm meeting the US trade representatives, Department of Commerce and our own equivalent business organisations, and then back here for Paddy's in Ireland, and then on to Brussels, where as part of the European presidency, we are now as social partners. We're at a trilateral with the trade union movement of Lithuania and Cyprus and our own, meeting President van der Leyen, President Costa, and then Ibec hosts a reception at the European Parliament every year. About 300 or 400 people come to it, and we met President Metsola of the Parliament. So in 2 weeks, kind of hitting a lot. And I forgot, I was in Cork as well with Prime Minister Starmer.
To a lot of people, yeah.
Yeah, really important actually, the British-Irish connection, I think, as well.
In DC, what did you get out of it? What did you get out of it, and what ultimately, I suppose, do Ibec clients get out of you having these sorts of engagements overseas?
Well, actually, last year and this year, we're definitely listening. Under the Trump 2, there's a lot of anger in the US against the European Union. On the basis it's like the Kissinger idea, who's in charge of the European Union. And I think this year the message was even more shrill that, now logically Europe is starting to say our trust in the United States, particularly around defence, has certainly been weakened. That this idea of a European preference or a kind of a buy Europe is certainly annoying the United States in terms of the investment they've made into Europe, but particularly into Ireland, the FDI in Ireland. There's a notion that put a lot of effort and a lot of resources here and would expect Ireland to be a conduit for the messages into the European Union.
And do you get a sense that there will be ramifications if it proceeds from the US side because of that?
Well, it's very hard to know at the moment. It's such a chaotic United States right now politically, and business has reacted in ways that we wouldn't have predicted 3 years ago. A lot of people have rolled over in terms of President Trump. We've seen that particularly in, the technology companies and, taking shares in companies as iconic for Ireland as Intel. But at the political level, and these would be political appointees, they very much have drank the Kool-Aid and would see Europe now as not being US friendly. And some of those things could be, say, on something like cybersecurity. Within the European legislation at the moment, that kind of European preference is in there, identifying, I think it's called a high risk vendor. And I think, a lot of people would see that as Chinese investment, but because it doesn't specify China, you could easily see an American brand name put into that category as well. So these are the type of things that really were coming across to us, not so much against Ireland, but against the EU. There's still kind of a positivity towards Ireland as being a good place to do business. But clearly the tensions between Europe and the United States was very pronounced this year.
What sort of KPIs do you set for those sorts of visits? Because it can be very hard to, it's always good to listen to people. It's always good to meet people and understand, I suppose, the nuances of position. But how do you gauge, was that actually worth my while? Especially in a moment like now where, as you say, it's chaotic. Can you even trust what you're hearing from people? Like, how do you gauge if this was a week well spent or however long you were there?
Yeah, I think it's longevity, you know. So as I said, we'd be probably doing it well over a decade at this stage. And so it's seeing how it's shifting by time. But also you've got to put in the effort to build relationships, be trusted, to be able to get that kind of messaging. Otherwise, it's just, tourism. You pop in, people say nice things, you don't learn very much. So I think it's going back again and again is part of our KPI and being receptive. You know, sometimes we're bringing the message. And certainly when we started off, we were talking about the recovery that was in Ireland and, you know, back in 2013, 2014, getting across the kind of open for business and then suddenly trying to explain the takeoff around the OECD, corporate tax work, etc., and Brexit clearly been another proposition. So in terms of KPI, we're not the IDA, we're not Enterprise Ireland. It's more about having those relationships in terms of what are the policy asks, you know, and being able to see very early on, back in 2022, that the ESG agenda was definitely gone stateside. And that's long before Donald Trump became president. You know, that what really was a catalyst for that was the interest rate rising. You know, when the interest rates went up, the shareholder suddenly had agency again. When the interest rate's near zero, shareholder finds it very hard to compete. People are able to get money because it's just been printed. So there was lots of unicorns.
So is it kind of seeing over the horizon that what happens in the States is quite likely to happen here, and that's what you can inform your...
Yeah, well, given our exposure to US FDI, they're all our members as well. It's useful to see what's happening back at home base, see what's in the kind of zeitgeist.
Do you get asked by your members? You know, what did you do? What did you do for me over there, Danny McCoy?
Yeah, because one of the things about Ibec, I guess, for the listeners here is that, you know, that's a singular brand and says that's our holding brand. Ibec owns 39 trade associations, and that ranges from, you know, biopharma or medtech or financial services, retail, and so on. So colleagues also come with those brands as well and are talking to their peers and to their members. So, you know, we do get the messages. They could be down at a level of that industry-specific asks. So, you know, again, the reporting back when we come back, like now, is time to tell people what we've done, have webinars and so on to our members and get the feedback from them as well too. Sometimes they won't get the message from their HQ as quickly as we can pick it up.
Okay. And when you talk about the relationship building and that it's been a dozen years that you've been doing this consistently, how far up the rung of the ladder here are we talking in terms of US influence? I mean, this is your opportunity to do some name dropping now, but, you know, how far up that power totem pole are you operating at? And are the relationships that you first built a decade or 10 years ago, are they still fruitful now? Yeah, no, they changed with administration as well, you know, but back in the day, we would have been in with Wilbur Ross in the Commerce Secretary, but we always get to see, you know, it might be Greer on this occasion or whoever the trade representative is. So we get to see fairly senior people. Probably, though, is the kind of more what would pass for their permanent government, as we might call it here, wouldn't change as much, and so you'd be able to get a better steer. It wouldn't be overly as political, but it's got much more political under Trump too. Yeah. So far, Ireland has probably been seen as avoiding the worst of the potential ramifications of the protectionist trade policy from the US administration. It still feels very fragile, that could change at any moment. What's your sense after the visit as to where Ireland is positioned? Yeah, I think clearly Ireland has been called out a couple of times. We've been called out with Germany in terms of having, on goods particularly, a big trade surplus. And in fact, the numbers that the United States were using were 2024. It's got even bigger in 2025. Did you tell them that? No, as I said, I was listening. Okay. I've told them now, given your reach here with the Business Post. But
I think Ireland is still seen more as a conduit for the US. I think what they're really concerned about is these, former great powers of Europe in terms of Germany and France, and particularly the French view of this European preference. I think is probably something that's really hitting out the digital companies, digital services, taxes, etc.
What's the Ibec position on the Europe first, or it's not the right terminology, the policy we've just been discussing?
Yeah, look, at one level, it's important for Europeans to get to the defence of Europe. And I think if there's a European preference, it should really be only guided in a specific area, and that would be around defence and security. A wider application of this, in terms of energy or food or retail or whatever it might be, will definitely be against the interests of small open economies like Ireland. So I think it's a Rubicon that we need to be careful with. When we started off in the European project, and particularly with the cohesion funds, which you have to be of an older stock to remember it particularly, there's this idea of centrifugal forces where the thing was spinning would spin outwards to hit the periphery. In the last year, I can see the centripetal forces as it spins right in towards the centre. And we are seeing the larger countries beginning to push ahead. We've had lots of evidence of that now in the last few weeks as well, with enhanced cooperation, and particularly with Savings and Investment Union, with the so-called E6, where you've got the big countries of France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Netherlands are interesting because they definitely put themselves forward as a big country, and despite the fact that in the Benelux they would have Luxembourg in that space, who've got a great big fund industry, and Ireland having a big fund industry, they're certainly pushing ahead with what is a Parisian push to have the centripetal force for the Savings Investment Union out of Paris.
Trying to join the big boys club. So Micheál Martin was generally seen last week as having done a good job. He emerged unscathed from the very public facing the Oval Office bit. But not everybody was as impressed. We had John Deasy in our paper writing about how, to his mind, the Taoiseach and his entourage didn't do the hard yards, didn't do the difficult work of meeting Congress.
Sure.
And having those kind of off-Broadway sort of meetings. What's your sense as to whether that was done to a sufficient degree, and I suppose how Micheál Martin did overall on the event?
Look, the Taoiseach did well in the moment. So it's a bit like popcorn, that in the sense of do you get in and get out without choking on it? And so he did well in the Oval Office by not creating a scene. I think if you strip it back, look, a society and a country have values, but we also have interests. And I think the balance in Ireland between what are our interests and what are our values have to be mixed. You can't be an absolute on your values. And we've seen this on difficult and knotty issues, Occupied Territories Bill being an example, that, you've got to, as a leader, take account of the interests of the country as much as the values. And I think he looked after our interests, and those who believe he should be pushing our values will have been disappointed. But if you don't look after your interests, you won't be in a position to help anybody with the values profess. And I think getting your values ahead of your interests, I think, could be a classic mistake that hubris brings to a country, and particularly a country that has trebled in its GDP. No other countries experienced the last decade like Ireland have. And we seem to be, believing our own hype at this point, in that we can suddenly put our interests to one side and lead out on our values. And I think felt that Taoiseach did admirably well. But to John Deasy's point, we could do more on our interests and the values. And I think they're the harder yards. And I guess Ireland's diplomatic service is building up. And I think that's a good thing as well. But we also can come to it, I'm sure. We have a big issue about our security and about our defence and about our capacity to be participants in the European project, but also for our own purposes, because let's be clear here, we're not on the edge of war, we're in a war. And Ireland's getting attacked. We've been attacked on our health system. We are vulnerable in terms of drone attacks. We're vulnerable in terms of our grid system being compromised. So, we know we're in a war, but we're not treating it as such.
And I mean, that is a very live and hugely important issue right across the continent, across the world, but it is largely outside of our control. There are some things that are in our control, like, for instance, the Mercosur agreement, which just today, as we were discussing on the way in, has been provisionally applied for now. Ireland not backing that, I mean, that is in our power to do something about it. What's your view and Ibec's view as to what course the government took there?
Well, I think the government had actually made its course in the programme for government, particularly with the rural TDs. So I know there's a big hue and cry about where Ibec was on those couple of days. The government had...
Where was Ibec?
We 25 years pushing for Mercosur, as if somehow in the government's gyrations that day that Ibec coming out was going to change that course of that. That's the easy government trying to find a scapegoat for their own issue. So look, trade deals are very important, but Ireland doesn't need additionality for trade right at the moment. This is an economy that's trebled in size. We've got our own controllable problems in terms of ensuring that we use the resources we have right now. And the other part about trade deals is that they're being piecemeal right now, because one of the things that was an underpin of any trade deal was the most favoured nation. So you do a deal with Mercosur, you should be willing to do that with everybody. And legitimately, the agri-food, particularly the meat industry, had interests in terms of level playing field there. I think it was being overdone, personally. But they had concerns. But more importantly, the government promised them that in the programme for government. So that was predestined.
You think the agri concerns were not quite as severe as was being made out?
I don't in the overall scheme of things, because overall it's good for business. Trade has proven to be good for business. This is a society that's built on trade. But one additional trade deal isn't going to change the trajectory of Ireland right now. We've other things that are much more significant. And the defence and security we were talking about there, I believe we do have things we can do meaningfully, because this idea that warfare takes place over in Ukraine or in the Middle East, it's happening here in our society right now in terms of the infrastructure that we have a duty to others for. Our cables are being mentioned all the time, but also our energy systems, our health systems, our food systems, going back to the Mercosur, ensuring that we have quality and can stand over what's being done. That's security. That's defence. So the trade deals, yes, of course, they're of interest, but there's actually more immediate issues to deal with, and that's where we concentrated our effort in Ibec.
And is it just that you feel like there are only so many issues that you can really dedicate time and resources to pushing, and that it just wasn't worth your while pushing Mercosur at this point?
The point here about Mercosur, that was a one-day wonder on a political front. The Taoiseach goes over in China, he's saying something, get a split in the coalition. They'd already predestined what they were going to do on that front.
But I suppose as a representative or lobby representation organisation, isn't the point that you should lobby for the view that you
And we have
hold?
for 25 years. We've been pushing for the Mercosur deal and all other deals. What I'm saying is that the actual thing that's important right now is the defence and security of the country. And in terms of even using our time here,
what should we do on the defence and security front?
Well, first of all, we're a very rich nation, a really rich nation. And that's not just at the level of the government running surpluses, it's also the level of the households and corporates. Because, ask any credit union, ask any of the banks, people aren't lending. Why aren't they lending? Because they got cash on their balance sheets. And we also, this debate about GDP, GNI star and so on, has a relevance, but GDP is actually the measure internationally to our commitments. And right now, our level of spending on defence and security is way off what could be deemed anyway ethical, given what's going on in the world in terms of the attack that the European project is coming under, and a European project that we've benefited so much for.
What level would you pitch the ethical or reasonable level at? Well,
we see countries right now, right at the edge, are at 5% of their GDP. That's what Trump was pushing NATO to do. 3% was the ambition before that. European countries aren't even there yet. They're 2.1%. We're 0.3%. So 7 to 10 times the amount we should be committing to. Right, 7 to 10.
Would you pitch it at about the 3? Is that reasonable for Ireland? Or?
Absolutely reasonable for Ireland. And also, it's the multiplier effect, is that this is not just transferring money elsewhere, although we might need to do it in cooperation. This is where the future is going to be in terms of innovation, in terms of the multiplier effect. Europe is about to go on a scale of investment to match the Marshall Plan post the Second World War. It's going to put future generations of Europeans into hock and debt, but the proposition here is don't spend it now. You will not have the Europe that previous generations had. And so we should be part of this project, but not just in terms of a virtual signalling to the world. It's actually in our own interest, because defending what we have here is going to be part of that overall system of European defence. And the other part is we've nothing to depreciate. So if we go in at, say, 3% of GDP, Other societies like Britain or France, their 3% will be going to just do the depreciation on stock that's going out of fashion, rusting away. If we come in here, we'd actually make a difference. We can make a difference with modernity in terms of cyber.
Where should we make the difference? Because the percentage is one thing, but we will only have, if you're of the view that there is value in doing it, which a lot of people are, we will only bring value in certain areas. So where should we do it?
Well, again, I'm not an expert in this, but in terms of digitalization, in terms of the cyber, but also in things that actually matter, is in terms of the security, the food systems, the energy systems, and so on. Defence and security are entwined. This is not about aggression. This is nothing at all got to do with neutrality. This has got to do about defending not just ourselves, but defending the European project in which we're involved with. And that relationship with Keir Starmer and so on, it's such a shame that more of that wasn't actually about the joint security and defence of the two islands. Because one of the things we're learning, unfortunately, is if globalisation is beginning to recede, and if the notion that Trump is trying to put the world into zones where they look after the Western Hemisphere in the Americas and China, kind of Asia, we're either going towards regionalisation, which is Europe, and that's changing. We could talk about that as well, how that's changing in terms of whether Ireland's going to be fully in, half out on that. But what we do know is in terms of localisation, these two islands are inextricably linked, not just through the Northern Ireland dimension. Northern Ireland is in NATO, by the way. So the issue of something happening in Dundalk versus something happening in Uri has two very different implications for a NATO member.
So do you think the government should be more forceful in articulating that position?
Absolutely. It's the same, it's consistent with what we talked about in terms of the Mercosur deal. And so that's why we're putting the emphasis on that, the security and defence topic. We've for a generation talked about trade deals. And if you can't secure what you have, trade deals no good to you.
And do you feel like you get a more receptive audience on the defence and security issue within government at the moment?
By the day.
By the day?
By the day, because unfortunately the world is changing by the day in
the Taoiseach's office or ministerial level or where?
Oh, I think just in the public realm more generally. But like we've seen some of the reports come out in terms of our maritime, in terms of the agreement in Cork, in terms of the government's view, in terms of the purchase with the French of defence and so on, is that people are beginning to realise that defence and security is not about military aggression. It's actually about securing our way of life and more, in my view, given my job, securing our underlying business model.
Has your job, would this something be...
Just look at Dubai as a business hub, right? See what's happening in the last month in terms of regions of the world which have been financial hubs. If you can't secure your territory, you can't secure your airspace.
Yeah. We spoke to the Taoiseach about something similar, about the evolution of the role of the Taoiseach's office and how it had become more international over the last while. Do you feel like your job has become more international focused over however many years?
Yeah, it's funny enough, the Irish business model has been international. So I'm 17 years as CEO of Ibec, and it's been nearly always international because a bit like Emily Dixon's, and we could not stop for the IMF, but they kindly stopped for us at the start. And then we're the great financial crash. Then we're into Brexit. Then we're into COVID. We're into the Ukraine-Russian war. Ireland's just been international for all of my adult life. And I guess
was your role at the head of Ibec always as international as it appears to be now?
I would say so, actually.
Yeah.
And in fact, I'm just apropos our last conversation, I think that we've got to bring it back to our domestic to say that what we have here domestically is actually part of the international, and security and defence is a really big issue. It has to be done here, not on foreign fields.
One issue that quite a few people over the last 2 months or so especially, have raised with us here, with me a little bit, but also with our reporters when we're just talking about other issues, is Carshon, the ruling from the Supreme Court around the Domino's workers, who were ruled to be employees essentially rather than casual workers. And that now has the cascading effect across all businesses, I suppose, in the state. It's a big upheaval for SMEs, for all businesses, but largely for SMEs. I think there was a lot of confusion around what it meant, the cost involved of getting professional advice.
Sure.
There was this deadline that was coming at the end of January, I think, that is now passed, and there's penalties if you don't get it right. What's the Ibec view, I suppose, firstly on the ruling, and were you getting a lot of inbound queries from your members on that?
Yeah, look, it's part of the gig economy, and that's been coming for quite a number of years. And so clearly, SMEs have been hit by a wall of legislation in recent times. But now here's yet another aspect in terms of the wage bill. You know, if you strip it all back, a lot of what SMEs have been hit with, particularly from the state, has been a tax on the wage bill. Be that in terms of higher minimum wages or leave or whatever. So it's yet another hit to contingency liability on a wage bill. So we certainly have been getting that being pushed at us.
People seem to think that they weren't well represented by any of the bodies or by anybody, that they had to go privately get their professional advice, which they would have to do anyway, obviously, for the actual core business function. Was that something that Ibec should have been more vocal on?
Yeah, we were very vocal on it, and actually we're lobbying on it. But there's a whole plethora of issues that can't be dealt with in isolation. This is like squeezing a balloon. You might have a win in this part and it goes out somewhere else, you know. So it's seen as the totality of the attack on the wage bill. And we've certainly, through the Labour Employer Economic Forum, been pushing that over the last 2 years.
And is that a topic that you're having to bring to the table there, or are others that are represented? Because there's loads of organisations obviously represented there. Is it cropping up from other delegates as well?
It says it on the tin. Ibec is a combination of business and employers confederation by our history. We're a trade union of employers. Yeah. And so that's Ibec is by the primary.
You mentioned
it's easier for others who actually don't actually have to go to the table with the trade unions to, prance around the place. But actually getting in there, it's a trade-off on various things. So it's not one single issue. You might win on one single issue, but you'll be losing on others.
I don't know if you refer to them as subsidiaries, but your
trade associations. Is that very difficult to manage? So you have Ibec as the kind of the head of the snake, and then you've 30, is it? 39.
39 below. And they obviously represent distinct parts of the economy.
Sure.
And will have their own MOs for certain topics.
Yeah.
Does that sometimes tie Ibec up, that the overarching view might be different to the subsidiary view?
Of course it does. Can do, does all the time. But what is really important is these aren't one-off games. It's seeing it all together. And Ibec is by far the biggest in Europe of its type, right? So as a business, Ibec is 52 million turnover business. We've got 350 staff, 39 brands, 10 locations, and we're also one of the biggest conduits of training through the skill nets and apprenticeship model. So Ibec itself, as a business, has to, mediate how we use our resources and how at any one time something might be leading, some might be lagging. But it's much more effective because I've seen it now, 17 years or equivalents across Europe. It's much easier to actually have an agglomeration of these for the more effectiveness of business. Yeah, someday somebody will be winning, someday somebody will be losing. They won't be pleased about that. But in the overall, this is a model that works. We've shown it's worked.
And overall, where there is a conflict, if you had one position and the managing director of the subsidiary, do you ultimately get to pull rank, I suppose? If you decide this is important enough, we're going to take my view of the world or the Ibec view of the world versus yours.
No,
how do you trash it out?
People are free to go out as long as it's coherent, well researched, and also coordinated in the sense of, is there a way of finding a common? Now, if there isn't, then whoever you're trying to influence on the outside world, be they the consumers or the politicians or whatever, the brands are free to go out and present their cases.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you about the role of the state?
Yeah.
During COVID, I think you did a Business Post event. It was up in the Liberties. I actually can't remember what the event was for, so I won't expect you to remember either. And I can't remember exactly, but you had a train of thought around the state needed to be bigger, basically.
Yes.
Which was a common theme during the pandemic and is the view that many people continue to hold today. It wasn't necessarily the view that I expected you to espouse.
Sure.
Was that of the moment? Do you still kind of feel like it should be a bigger state? And if so, why and where?
Yeah, and sometimes the state's too big in some areas. So, for instance, I would believe the state is too big in the housing market right now in terms of paying for the housing markets. Like in terms of the private sector transaction, the state was not far shy of 50% in help to buy and so on, when it'd be much more important that we actually get the housing stock and then perhaps even in childcare. The state certainly has taken up that role much more significantly, and it's not clear it's done so in the best coordinated way. So it's not that I believe the state should be bigger in every facet of our life, but we've seen nearly 1 million extra private sector workers in the last half a generation, and pretty much having dipped, come back up, the same amount of public sector workers. When a society gets richer, it wants to have its public services personified. We want to have better ratios when it comes to teachers or nurses or doctors or physiotherapists or therapists for childhood intervention. And also businesses would need more regulators in the sense to get faster decisions and so on, and not have the queues and rationing. So that was my rationale, and I still believe the case that the state in that regard is too small.
Okay. I'm conscious of your points that there are so many points we could discuss. Is there anything that you think is particularly pressing that we haven't yet touched on?
No, I think maybe just to reiterate, I believe with my experience, and particularly in Europe, because our umbrella group in Europe is Business Europe, and with some brass neck as an Irish person, I've managed to get the chairmanship of the Defence and Security for Business Europe. And that's not about the defence industry. That's about the fact that this thing goes right across our society, from the labour market in terms of people having the right skill sets. AI is something I'm sure we could have talked about. My view about AI is not coming fast enough. The same point I was making earlier on. People are doing jobs now that could easily be transferred to providing those services I talked about that matter to people in terms of care, in terms of intervention and so on. So instead of the drudgery of doing it. So AI is going to be disruptive, but it could be disruptive in a great way to free up humans to do proper human things. And so the last piece is on that European dimension is, unfortunately, the world has just got a lot uglier. The next 10 years is going to be all about security and defence. And for the Irish business community, we need our society to join us in that, to say Ireland has a moral responsibility in our interests, and only through ensuring our interests we'll be able to express our values, which I also concur with.
Mm-hmm. We have another AI podcast in the Business Post. We'll come back to hear your thoughts on that on the AI podcast at some stage. Danny, thanks very much for coming into us. I appreciate it.
Welcome back to the Business Post podcast with me, Danny McConnell.
And me, Peter O'Dwyer.
So, Danny McCoy, what did you think? Were you surprised?
I thought it was a really interesting interview because he engaged on everything and was pretty frank, even in some areas where I thought he might be less so. So we discussed before the interview about the 39 different trade associations. And I put the question to him of, does that tie you up if you've got 39 individual agendas beneath the overarching agenda of Ibec? It would seem like that would come into conflict quite a lot. And I thought he'd maybe skirt around it or kick to touch.
No, he didn't.
He didn't at all. He said, of course it does. It can and it does and it will continue to.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting. I thought our discussion on Mercosur was interesting because, again, as we kind of touched upon a couple of minutes ago.
Did he cut a defensive tone, do you think?
I think he probably knew that the question was coming.
Yeah.
Because we in the Business Post had been writing about this, and we had been writing about where Ibec was on it, because it was really noticeable from our point of view. I mean, again, just looking at it through our prism of journalistic, what lands in the inbox even. Ibec, and I say this to their credit, land in our inbox about all sorts of issues all the time. As I said before the interview, they're on it with their policy positions for a lot. And I was almost checking my Outlook to see, was there a problem with it, that there was nothing coming on Mercosur. And even when we proactively went to speak about it, there was really nothing. I think at one point we were pointed towards a policy document from the end of November of last year, which wasn't even explicit. It was explicit in supporting free trade agreements, but not explicit in supporting Mercosur.
Yeah.
Now, Danny's explanation, I suppose, is reasonable on one level. We were pushing the boat, he says, for 25 years, got nowhere, ship had sailed, it was in the programme for government. I mean, I do think if the biggest lobby group, the biggest business lobby group in supposedly the most pro-free trade, pro-enterprise country in Europe isn't until the very last moment pushing the envelope to get this backed, I kind of don't know who does.
So what do you think was at play then? What do you think was going on?
I mean, I take him at face value that he just thought, no win to be had here. We've tried this. We've done whatever we can do.
Yeah.
And
he seemed to allude that they were sort of being scapegoated by the government.
Yes. Yeah. And he seemed to suggest that basically their time was just better used elsewhere. And I suppose my view now, Danny McCoy has run Ibec for 17 years. I've run Ibec for precisely 0 days. So I take his point if he wants to come back and say he knows better on how to do it. But I would think you can walk and chew gum at the same time. You can talk about the defence and security situation, which is incredibly important, whilst also still having the year of government on Mercosur. And I know Danny says like it was 25 years in the making, and the wobble from Micheál Martin in China was a one-day thing on the Wednesday before it was to be signed. I take that, but you might just go out there, maybe just a chink of light. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time, you know well from programmes of government, it wouldn't be the first time a commitment in a programme for government was changed, rescinded, scrapped, explained away.
And for me, I just thought, like, it was bad politics. Like, it was clear to me that there was an attempt to change the position, all belated or, ill-judged. And I think as we reported that weekend from, the Fine Gael side of the house, that if you're going to change position, you need to kind of prep the ground for it. And it wasn't there. But if you're consistently beating a drum for 25 years or 24 years, 364 days of the year, and then you go silent on the key day, it does raise questions. And I do think, I think it was legitimate to ask him and press him on that. But I do think he was prepped for that way. I do think he was prepped for that particular one. I was struck, however, by his commentary around defence and the force of which he said Ireland needs to increase, not by, not doubling or tripling, but by 7 or 8 times we need to increase the amount of defence spending. And he's not talking about kind of being an aggressive force. He's merely talking about our own backyard, our security here. And I thought that was an interesting position for him to take. And I suppose it puts it up to the government, because we know that there has been this investment programme into the defence forces coming from a very low basis, doesn't and whether or not even that ambition level 2, I think, or his level of ambition 2 of the programme, there's 3 levels of ambition that were designated: low, medium, high. They've gone for the middle ground. Simon Harrison now, I think, when he was in defence, had sort of made the point about wanting to get to kind of the level 3, but still at that we're way off the sort of pace that Danny McCoy is talking about. I just wonder how realistic. I know the world has changed. We all know the world has changed, but how realistic is that increase in investment, from an Irish government that clearly doesn't show any appetite for it?
I don't think it's immediately going to come to pass, but I suppose Danny would see his role as you set the stake where it ought to be and let them get there hopefully as quick as they can. I think you're right about like the ambition the government has increased its spend, but not as much as some people would think they should have. Now, some people have the complete opposite opinion, of course, that we shouldn't spend anything. I think I think the average person probably feels like we should be able to protect our own patch, our own waters, our own undersea
but
cables.
Anyone with common sense would understand that, like, that argument of we shouldn't spend anything just doesn't hold any water anymore.
Yeah, so I think the average person feels like the middle ground of, if we can defend our own waters, our own airspace, our own subsea cables, and maybe provide, specific types of technological help in a way, whether it's demining or whatever we've been offering to Ukraine. I think that's the kind of position of the average voter. Some people think it's further, spend more, do more. I think, like I described it at one stage of, ultimately that conflict is something that's outside of our control. I think Danny would take a different view, that it is within our control. Obviously not to be a protagonist and bring it to a finish or anything, but that we do have a far bigger role to play in that.
Because he saw it not just in a sort of purely militaristic sense, he saw it in the security of sea cables. He referenced the cyber hacks on the HSE and elsewhere, the vulnerabilities that we have. We don't, we can't patrol our own airspace, or, we're still not at the race when it comes to our airspace and our sea.
The way he couched it, I thought was interesting, and I think fair, I suppose, is when I was talking about the additionality, as he explained it, of free trade deals and doing more. He was saying additionality is no good if you can't protect what you have.
Exactly.
And if we can't protect our subsea cables and whatever else, well then we're in trouble.
I was quite surprised. I'm not sure what I expected going into the interview, but I actually was surprised at a lot of the points that he raised. I thought he made a very convincing argument. I thought there's clearly a brain there. Like, and I'm not saying I didn't think there was a brain there before, but let's say that. But I thought he was quite impressive in some of the commentary that he made. And there is clearly a thought process both from within Ibec and his own leadership as to what the country needs to do in order. And there were many issues that we didn't get to. We didn't talk about infrastructure. We didn't talk about AI, or where we.
Well, we did touch on AI just to finish.
Yeah.
And I thought he was really interesting there, because a lot of people, understandably, are kind of saying, be cautious with this. We can see the potential power it has. Danny said, I don't think it can come quick enough. It has to free up people. People are doing work that they ought not to be doing at the moment. This needs to come quicker, free them up to do. I think he described it as like real human work or something to that effect. I thought it was interesting. I think what has been interesting about our series of interviews in this very brief podcast so far is that people are being frank, maybe more so than I would have found in traditional print interviews for some reason.
Tell them that, maybe, for God's sake. Like.
No, but it's frank in a way that, like, they're really expressing their worldview, their point of view. They're willing to engage on topics in a very serious way and just be kind of unapologetic about what they believe and their course of action, which I think has been good.
Because I felt that actually in Kevin Harrington's interview with Fionn Thompson last week. I felt it in Susan Brady's interview. And then I thought Daniel did as we said at the time, I thought Daniel Murray did a great job with Micheál at the time, just really pressing. They got into really detailed, about pretty material stuff. I thought it was interesting. And
I think they're coming out the better for being frank and being upfront. I think the feedback that I've gotten anyway, I think the same with you, is they're quite revealing in a way that maybe people wouldn't have thought that they would be, and they see their strengths more so than if they were guarded and trying to shut stuff down.
Maybe we're just superb interviewers.
Maybe learning, Danny.
Exactly. Well, listen, that's it for now. Thank you so much for either watching us here on YouTube or listening to us on wherever you get your podcast. But for now, for me, Danny McConnell.
And me, Peter O'Dwyer.
Thanks for watching. I will see you soon.